The purpose of this video is to show how a mid-century bedside table is made. I'll take you through all the processes that I use to make a table like this. The first step in the construction of this bedside table is to make all the pieces of timber from which it will be constructed. They need to be wider than a standard board that is purchased. This table is made from a timber called Tasmanian oak, which is an Australian timber. I live in Australia, and however they need, as I said, they need to be made wider. So you'll see me in this first step cutting all the boards so that they are wide enough from which to make the table. Before I cut the first piece, I realised that I need to, because of its length, I need to support it on the other side of the saw. You'll see here I use a sliding table on my saw to make the cuts, and the piece that I put on top of the bench saw, is just to support the offcut so that it doesn't fall towards the blade when I make the cut. In other videos I'll show how to make one of those slide tables. In fact, I've made a new one since I used this one last, and I'll show how it is made and how effective it is. The next bit of footage is just showing the same thing being done through different angles. So you can see just a different aspect, and you can see how the slide table saw is set up. Having been cut to size, the pieces now need to be joined. I use an aliphatic resin glue. You can use PVA glue, but I believe the aliphatic resin glue is very similar to PVA, but it's a bit better. And you'll see that I try the pieces in different positions just to get the best possible join. The important thing to watch is to make sure that you have the grain in the same direction, because it makes it much better to sand and get the final finish. This particular glue doesn't need to be put onto both pieces, but neither does PVA glue, but I've always put glue on both pieces, and it means you probably waste a little bit. Waste a bit of glue because you're using more than you need to, but I'd rather use too much glue than too little, and I always find it better to use it on both. It won't hurt you, so there's no problem spreading it with your finger. It's just a water-based glue, so you can wash your hands afterwards. There's no chemicals in there that are going to do you any harm. And the thing is not to rush it. There's no need to be super fast with it. The glue takes quite a while to set, certainly longer than you need to put it on and position and clamp the pieces. So once they're positioned, just a couple of clamps will hold it together. I use pipe clamps for anything that's larger than too big for a G clamp or F clamp. Only 2 clamps are needed for this particular size, but if I was going to use a 3rd clamp, I would put the third clamp underneath to make sure that the pieces stayed flat. It wasn't really necessary here, but so I didn't put a third clamp on. I found that I needed some blocks because I wanted to lift it off the table. I didn't really want to. The glue was going to squeeze out when you apply the pressure, and I didn't really want to glue the piece to my bench top. It also allows you to get the clamps in a better position so that the piece is closer to the pipe. Therefore you get a better clamping action if you have the clamp closer to the pipe than further away. I had a bit of problem with that clamp, so what I did was I had to replace the pipe. You check that the two pieces are aligned as close as you can get them. If there's any bowing in it, it's a bit more difficult, but these were fairly flat pieces, so no, didn't have that issue. And that's it. Wait for it to dry. The next step is to make the legs. Because there are 2 bedside tables with 4 legs each, there'll be a total of 16 pieces that are required, because I made each leg out of 2 pieces joined. So in this sequence you'll see me, the first thing I'll do is cut the pieces to length. In all these pieces that are joined together to make a bigger piece, the initial cuts, that, as you'll see here, are never to the exact size. I'll cut them oversized, then do the final cut to the exact length after the pieces have been joined. That way you don't have to worry about aligning the ends exactly. You can just leave them roughly in the position against each other, but then you can cut both ends off, cut one end off and then cut the other end off to the right length. Once cut, they are then glued and joined. I said in a previous video that I used my finger to spread the glue, but in this case the area being glued is at least double as the thickness of the other pieces, and therefore I I used a spreader. It's actually not a woodworking tool, it's a kitchen utensil, and it's a silicon, made of silicon, and the actual bristles, if you like, if you can call them bristles, were much longer, double the length that you see here, and which is a bit long, and also because they were much longer, they were too flexible to spread glue properly, therefore I just cut them down. I'm not frightened of using anything that's useful to do a job, but whether it's for designed and made for woodworking or not. If it does the job, we'll use it. The beauty of having a silicon glue spreader, of course, is that the glue doesn't stick to it very well, so it's very easy to remove with water. As you'll see, I checked for alignment then, and as you'll see in this next sequence, I had to apply a bit of gentle persuasion with a hammer to get them as aligned as closely as I could. I never use a normal metal hammer for this sort of thing. It'll do a lot more damage to the pieces than this hammer, which is plastic on one side and rubber on the other. Rubber's a bit too flexible, and the plastic's fine. You'll see one end gave me a lot more trouble than the other. But the closer you can get them aligned, the lot easier it will be to sand and do the other processes. And eventually it's done. Having joined all the material for the legs, the next process is to get them to the right size in terms of squareness, so that they are all a little bit bigger when they're joined than I want them to be. So I run them through the thicknesser to get them to the right size, in squareness, so they will be square to start with. As you see later, they end up as tapered legs, but at this point I need to have them all the same size and square. It takes a little bit of time to run them all through the thickness. At this stage I'm just trying to get the thicknesser set up to do the right size for one. Then I'll just proceed and do all the others the same. The legs have now been made and squared, and now they need to be docked to length. Firstly, one end is cut on each of the four legs you see here. That's just to square them up, because as I said, they're not aligned exactly on the ends when I glue them. block is now set in place on the tape measure attached to the sliding table, and this will give the exact length to the legs. I've already mentioned that the legs are going to be tapered, and in this sequence you'll see how that's done. It's done with a taping jig. I won't describe it here, I'll do it in another video. But basically you run the actual jig through the saw with the leg on it, and it produces the taper. And it has to be done cut on all four sides, of course. And as I said, I won't go into details here, but I could have had the camera in a different angle, but it was difficult. It's difficult to film something like this because the best angle is from the back, but unfortunately you have to position yourself to push it through the saw, so you can see most of the cut anyway, and you can see that it's held on a jig and run through the saw to get the right angle. It becomes more difficult when you've done the two sides because you've got a taper. You have a taper on the other two sides, and so there's a bit of fooling about to do to set it up properly. But as I said, I won't go into detail here. It's for all intents and purposes, a jig is used to create the taper. You'll see me use a digital vernier here to check the the actual size of the legs, I use a digital vernier a lot in my woodworking. Many pieces had to be joined to make the two bedside tables in this project, and I've already showed you the joining of one piece, which consisted of two pieces being joined to make one. This sequence shows three pieces being joined to make one piece, simply because it was wider. There are quite a few of those too. So there's a lot of joining to be done, but and I haven't shown it all. I've only shown a couple of the different sizes that were joined. I chose to use the spreader rather than my finger on these two, even though I could have used my finger, but it does keep your hands a lot cleaner, which is probably why I chose it there, because I had to handle the boards a lot more, and therefore you don't want to get glue onto the face surfaces. It's okay on the edge, but you don't want to get it onto the faces. If there's a lot of material to be removed, I'll use a belt sander rather than any other type of sander, just because it's so quick to do. I'll then finish it off and do finer sanding with a random orbit sander, which you'll see shortly. In this case, I had to remove more material from the leg, so I used the inverted belt sander to do it. The one process in woodworking that seems to be universally hated is sanding, but unfortunately it's a necessary part of the job. Anybody who ever told me they like sanding, I'd be a bit worried about their mental state. But anyway, I find the best tool to use is a random orbit sander. It's attached, you'll see the hose there. It attaches to my dust extractor, which is generally used on my table saw. It's connected all the time to my table saw, but I also connect it to the thicknesser and anything else that I use that I can attach it to, like the random orbit sander, because it does a much better job of withdrawing the dust as you sand. Whenever I sand, I have an old sheet I put on the table. It just protects the wood from, if it rests on any bits of sawdust or that sort of thing, it can get damaged, and you'd only have to then resand it. So I use an old sheet just to protect it while I sand it. And I often do the same thing with when I assemble. I have some sort of cover on there to protect the pieces while I'm assembling them. If you have similar items, same size, that need to be sanded, one little trick is what you see here, and that is to put in this case 4 them together and sand them all at the same time. It's a lot quicker, but not only that, it prevents, if you wanted a sharp corner on these legs, which I didn't, but if you did, it would, having them like this prevents you, or at least makes it less likely that you're going to round the corners. I didn't need to do that in this case because I did round the corners anyway. I don't like sharp, what's called an arris, which is the sharp corner on a piece of timber. I don't like it because it's too easily damaged, and I don't think it looks as nice either. But in this case it was much faster to sand all the flat surfaces first and round the corners later. And doing it this way is much quicker. Sanding a big piece is really no different to a small piece. Sadly, it's no more pleasurable. In fact, it's probably less pleasurable because it takes you longer. But once again, I just use a random little sander with 180 grit and just get into it. At least with the random little sander, it's a lot faster than the other way. Docking the bigger pieces to size is a similar operation to what you saw with the other smaller pieces. One clear cut has to be done on one edge, and it has to be a continuous cut right along, and you'll see I made a couple of adjustments here to ensure that I had that before I cut the other side. And once that clear cut is made, stop block is moved to position to give the exact length of the piece. And the piece is recut to be the length required. And this process of course is completed for every one of the big pieces, although I'm only showing one here. I picked up a ruler just to do a double check that the size was right. To cut the pieces to length, they're docked using the slide table, but to get them to width, it's far easier and more accurate to do it with the fence. So I've set the fence up, and the yellow piece going in there is a mag switch featherboard, which I highly recommend and have been using for many years. That holds it in position and keeps your fingers well away from the blade. And so if one cut is done on one side, say the front for example, then the fence will be reset and a cut will be made, the second cut is made on the back, and that cuts it to the correct width. To join the pieces together, I chose to use a biscuit jointer. That wasn't essential. You could use screws to join it, and of course glue as well, but I had a biscuit jointer, so I chose to use it. It means you don't have to have any, there's no screws showing, and therefore there's nothing to cover. Before you finish, you can just sand and then finish, and there's no exposed screws. There were no screws used in the construction of this, except to hold hardware together. For example, the runners, the draw runners, were used that were held in with screws. But really, that's the only thing in there. There's only metal that's in the construction. The bedside tables have an internal shelf. It's necessary to put some biscuit slots in the middle of a panel, not only on the edges, and therefore a batten is used to position, to enable the positioning of the biscuit jointer into the right position on the actual sides, which will hold the shelf. Each table has a single drawer, and I chose to make the drawers out of white melamine. It gives a much cleaner finish inside than using timber, which would have to be finished. In this case, the tables are finished with tung oil, and I didn't really want to have tung oil inside a drawer. It would go rancid, so I made them out of white melamine board, which are just cut up like this. The slot had to be cut into the sides of the drawers to hold the bottom, which I decided to make out of 3mm acrylic, which I have plenty of because it's what I use when I make the Japanese shoji screens. In order to do that, the riving knife and the guard had to be removed, which is a very, very simple operation with a saw-stop saw, which is what I have. And so, having done that, I just cut the slots into the bottom of into the sides of all the drawers. Here you can see one drawer, two sides, back and the front, and the bottom just on the table saw. Laid out on the bench are all the components that make up our cabinet. It's a bit tricky to assemble them all, but some I've already joined some of the biscuits into the slots, I believe, and then but there is a certain sequence you have to do them. Obviously the shelf has to go in first, and it can't go in later. The internal halves of the drawer runners are already attached because you cannot get inside to do it after it's assembled, so they have to be in place before the assembly is done. It goes without saying, when you look at this photo, that I had some issues clamping. I barely had enough clamps, but it was hardly enough places to put them. In this sequence you'll see the drawer runner fitted to a completed drawer. The legs attached to the bottom of the cabinet with little metal pieces that are available from most hardware stores. Just 3 screws. They have to be positioned correctly, of course. You can't see in this, with the videoing, you can't see that the position where they will be fitted is marked, but it is. And then they're just screwed into place. The legs attach with bolts. It's a bolt one end and has a thread, timber thread the other. So it's attached into the bottom end of the top of the leg, I should say, and then it's just screwed in. I use two nuts locked together, and then with a spanner to put them into the holes in the tops of the legs, and then they just bolt in. I've already mentioned that these bedside tables were finished with tung oil, and that's the product there, which is applied with a brush. Just follow the directions on the can, and it's a hardy finish, but it's not a normal finish that I would use. I normally use either a water-based lacquer or a standard nitrocellulose lacquer. With all work completed, there is a finished mid-century bedside table.